There was a drawer in that kitchen. You probably remember one like it. Not the silverware drawer. The other one. The deep one, near the stove, that never fully closed. Inside it lived a ball of string, a folded paper bag, a spool of gray thread, 2 buttons that didn't match anything, and a short pencil worn down to almost nothing. To a child, it looked like a drawer full of nothing. To the woman who ran that house, it was the beginning of almost everything. Because when something was needed in a Depression-era home, bread for the morning, soap for the wash, a dress for a growing girl, a salve for a cough that wouldn't quit, that mother did not reach for her coat and her purse. She did not think first about the store. She thought first about her own 2 hands. And she asked herself a question that has almost completely disappeared from the American home. Not, where can I buy this? But something older, harder, and far more honest. What can I make? We don't ask that question anymore. We've been trained out of it. Somewhere along the way, the American home learned that every need has a product, every problem has an aisle, and every aisle has a price. We stopped being people who could make things. We became people who could only buy them. But there was a time, inside living memory for some of you, and inside your mother's memory for almost all of you, when a woman standing in a plain wooden kitchen could feed a family, clothe a family, clean a house, and doctor a sick child, using little more than what she already had on the shelf and everything she carried in her head. She didn't call it a skill. She didn't call it self-sufficiency. She wouldn't have known what to do with a word that fancy. She called it getting the family through another week. But make no mistake about what she actually was. Inside the hands of one ordinary woman lived a baker, a seamstress, a soap maker, a nurse, a gardener, a cook, and the sharpest household manager money never had to hire. She was an entire main street of small shops, folded into one apron, working by the light of one window. And here is the part that should stop you cold. Most of what she made, we now buy. Every single thing she produced in that kitchen with her own hands, the modern home now orders, subscribes to, or picks up in a plastic package. We didn't just lose her recipes, we lost the ability the recipes required. We became, maybe for the first time in history, a generation that pays more and knows less. This is not a video about being poor. It's not about doing without. Those women often had very little, and their lives were genuinely hard, and no one should pretend otherwise. This is a video about what they could do. Because a poor house with a skilled mother in it was never a helpless house. Over the next half hour, we're going to walk back into that kitchen, and that laundry, and that sewing corner, and we're going to name 25 things Depression-era mothers made with their own hands instead of buying, from bread to soap to medicine to the very clothes on their children's backs. And I want you to keep a private count as we go. Not a count of how many of these things you remember. A harder count than that. How many of these could you still make yourself, today, if the store were closed and no one was coming to help? Keep that number in your mind. We'll come back to it at the end. For now, pull up a chair at that plain kitchen table, in the good light near the window, and let's start where every one of those homes started its day. We start in the kitchen, before sunrise, with a woman, a bowl, and no plan to buy a single thing. The kitchen woke up before the family did, while the house was still dark and cold. Before a single child had stirred, that mother was already standing at the table in a thin robe, and the first thing her hands touched was not a switch or a package. It was flour. The first thing she made was bread. Not opened, not unwrapped, made. She kept a bowl going that most homes had a name for, a soft, living mass of flour and water and yeast that she fed and kept from one baking to the next, so that a part of yesterday's loaf was always folded into tomorrow's. She knew the dough by feel, not by clock. She knew when it was too stiff and needed a little more water, when it was too slack and needed a dusting more flour, and she knew all of this in her fingers, without a single measuring cup, because her mother had put that knowledge into her hands the same way years before. And bread in that house was not one thing. From the same flour, the same bowl, the same pair of hands, came the morning biscuits. Quick, warm, ready before the coffee. Came the cornbread that stretched a thin supper into something that filled a working man. Came the flat, plain rolls for Sunday, made a little finer because Sunday deserved a little finer. Think about what that actually means. One woman, standing at one table, was the entire bread aisle. Every loaf, every roll, every biscuit that a modern family now loads into a cart in plastic sleeves. She produced all of it, warm, by hand, in the dark, before the day had even properly begun. And she did it not once, not as a hobby on a Saturday, but again and again and again, week after week, year after year, because if she stopped, the family did not eat. We buy bread now, we stand in front of 40 kinds of it, and complain that none of them taste like anything, and they don't. Because bread stopped being something a house made and became something a house purchased. We traded the warm loaf under the towel for the cold bag on the shelf, and we called that progress. Then there was the matter of coffee and drippings and the fat that ran nothing to waste, but made new things from scratch. Here I want to be careful, because it would be easy to slide into leftovers, and this is not about leftovers. This is about making. When that mother rendered fat, she wasn't just saving a spoonful in a can. She was manufacturing an ingredient, a cooking fat that would become the base of the next week's biscuits, the grease that would fry the potatoes, the shortening that no one had to run out and buy because she had produced it herself in her own skillet. The store sold shortening in a tin. She made her own, and it cost her nothing but attention. She made the broth, not the leftover from a bird, the broth itself, built on purpose, coaxed out of bones and scraps and an onion and a long, patient afternoon on the back of the stove. A good broth was the secret spine of that whole kitchen. It turned a handful of vegetables into soup. It turned soup into supper. It carried flavor into a pot of beans that would otherwise have been plain. Today that same thing sits on a shelf in a carton, marked up and salted down, and families pay for it by the quart and think they've discovered something clever. She had it simmering in the back of the stove for free, and she had it because she knew how to make it, which is a different thing entirely from knowing where to find it. She made the gravy and the sauce from nothing, a little of that saved fat, a spoonful of flour, some of that broth or some milk, and a wrist that knew exactly how long to stir and exactly when to stop. From those 3 humble things, she built a sauce that made a plain plate of food feel like a meal a person could be proud to set down in front of a hungry family. There was no jar, there was no packet. There was a woman, a pan, and a technique that lived in her arm. She made the jam and the jelly and the fruit butter. And here, again, I want to hold the line. This was not about rescuing fruit that was going bad. This was production. When the fruit came in, whether from the yard, the neighbor, or the cheapest crate at the market, she turned it into something that would carry the family's sweetness clear through the winter. She stood over a hot pot in a hot kitchen in the worst heat of the year and cooked fruit and sugar down until it set, and she filled her jars and she lined them up, and that shelf of glowing color was a kind of wealth. It was breakfast in February that cost nothing in February. A modern family buys jam. She made the sweetness her children would spread on the bread she had also made. 2 skills stacked on top of each other in one small kitchen. She made the syrup. When there was no money for the real thing, she made her own from sugar and water and a little of whatever flavor the house had. And the children poured it over those morning biscuits and never knew, or never minded, that it had been born on the stovetop that same week, instead of trucked in from a factory. She made the pickles and the relish and the kraut. The sharp, bright things that woke up a plain plate, she made those too, in crocks and jars, out of the plainest vegetables, using nothing but salt, time, and the kind of patience the modern kitchen has completely lost. She knew that a cabbage and a little salt, and a few weeks of waiting, became something a family looked forward to. Waiting was part of her craft. Today we consider any wait to be a defect. She considered it the recipe. She made the butter, when there was cream to be had, and she made the cheese from the milk that turned. A jar, a strong arm, and time gave her butter. A pot, a little acid, and a cloth gave her a soft, fresh cheese. 2 more shelves of the modern store, produced by one woman who simply knew how. Now, step back from the stove with me for a moment, because I don't want you to miss the size of what we're looking at. Everything I've just described happened in one room. The bread, the broth, the sauce, the sweet things, the sharp things, the fat, the dairy. Add them up. That is a bakery, a cannery, a dairy, and a soup kitchen. All running out of a single wood stove, all managed by a single woman, who also had to get the children up, dressed, and off, and who did not think of any of this as remarkable. That is the part that should sit heavy with you. She didn't think it was remarkable. To her, it was just Tuesday. And this is where the story has to leave the kitchen, because that mother's hands did not stop working when the meal was done. When the plates were cleared, she turned to a whole second body of knowledge that the modern home has forgotten even more completely than it forgot how to cook. She turned to the problem of keeping a house clean, when the house could not afford to buy a single thing to clean it with. She made the soap. Sit with that one, because it may be the purest example of everything this video is about. Somewhere in that home, usually out back, that woman took fat she had saved and a harsh substance she handled with real care, and quite literally, performed chemistry in a pot in her own yard. She turned 2 rough materials into the thing that washed her family's bodies, her family's clothes, her family's dishes, and her family's floors. One batch. Every cleaning need in the house. Think about how far that is from where we stand now. Walk down the cleaning aisle of any modern store and count the bottles. A different colored bottle for the counter, for the floor, for the glass, for the tub, for the dishes, for the hands, for the laundry. A dozen products, a dozen prices, a dozen plastic jugs, each one promising to solve a problem she solved with a single pot of soap and the knowledge of how to make it. We didn't get cleaner, we got sold. We took one skill and shattered it into 20 purchases. She made the cleaners and the scouring. For the tougher jobs, she reached not for a can, but for the plain, cheap things every kitchen already held. The mild grit that scoured a pan back to bright. The sour liquid that cut grease and left the windows clear. The boxed powder that pulled odors out of the air. And the icebox. She knew which humble thing did which job, and she combined them without a thought, because that knowledge was ordinary in her world. It has become almost secret knowledge in ours. People now pay good money for bottles that promise to be natural and simple, selling back to us, at a premium, the exact plain ingredients our grandmothers kept under the sink for pennies. She made the stain remover and the spot treatment. A dropped supper, a child's grass-stained knee, a spot of grease on the good tablecloth. She did not throw the cloth out, and she did not buy a special product. She knew the specific trick for the specific stain. Sun and lemon for one thing, a paste for another. Cold water, always, before the stain set, because she knew a warm wash would lock it in forever. This was a real body of knowledge, passed woman to woman, and it meant that clothes lasted, and linens lasted, and a stain was a small problem to be handled, instead of a garment ruined. She made the polish. The furniture that had come down through the family, the few good pieces, were kept alive and glowing, not with a spray from a can, but with simple oils, and a soft cloth, and a slow, circular patience. That table shined because she tended it, the same way she tended everything, by hand, on a schedule she carried in her head. Here is the uncomfortable truth underneath all of it. Every one of these things she made instead of buying, the soap, the cleaners, the polish, required her to understand her house. She understood what fat became. She understood what acid cut. She understood what the sun could bleach and what the cold could set. She was, in the truest sense, the engineer of that home, and when the modern family traded all of that understanding for a shelf of colorful bottles, it didn't just lose a few recipes. It lost the ability to understand its own house at all. We became people who can no longer clean a stain without an app, a video, and a special purchase. in a house our grandmothers could have run blindfolded. And we haven't even gotten to the hardest skill yet, because the kitchen and the cleaning were the parts a family could see. The next thing she often made late at night, alone, in the last of the light, when everyone else had gone to bed. She made the clothes. The house was quiet now. The children were down, the supper was cleared, the morning bread was already rising under its towel for the next day. And that mother, who had been on her feet since before the sun, pulled a chair close to the one good lamp, reached into a basket, and picked up a needle. This was the hour of the day she made the clothes. She made the dresses out of the sacks. You know this one. Some of you are already smiling, because you either wore one or your mother did. The flour came into that house in cloth sacks, and the companies that sold the flour were not fools. They printed those sacks in flowers and stripes and cheerful little patterns, because they knew, everyone knew, that the sack was not going in the trash. The sack was going to become a dress, and that mother, with no pattern she'd paid for, and often no pattern at all, would look at a growing girl and look at 2 or 3 matching sacks and see, in her mind, a finished dress before a single stitch was cut. She measured with her eye and her hands and a length of string. She cut, she sewed, sometimes by hand, sometimes at a treadle machine she pumped with her own foot, and a little girl went to school in a brand new dress that had, a week before, held the family's flour. Understand what that is. That is a seamstress. Not a woman who mended, we'll get to mending, but a woman who could manufacture a garment from raw cloth, fit it to a living, growing body, and finish it well enough that no one at school knew or cared where the fabric had come from. The modern world sends its clothes across an ocean to be made by strangers. She made them across the kitchen table, by lamplight, for the specific child asleep in the next room. She made the aprons, and the shirts, and the little clothes for the little ones. From the same skill flowed everything. The apron that protected the one good dress, the soft gowns for the baby, the simple shirts, each one cut to a real person, made to be let out and taken in as that person grew, because these clothes were built to be lived in for years and handed down after that. She made the quilts. And here I have to stop you again, because it is tempting to call this using up scraps, and that misses the whole miracle of it. Yes, the pieces came from worn-out clothes and cloth too small for anything else. But look at what she did with them. She did not just pile them together to keep warm. She arranged them. She built a pattern, a star, a ring, a field of squares. She planned the colors. She pieced hundreds of small shapes into one deliberate, beautiful design, and then she quilted the whole thing together, stitch by tiny stitch, a labor of weeks and sometimes months. She made art that a family slept under. She turned the ended lives of old clothes into a warm, deliberate, beautiful thing that could last 2 generations, and carry, sewn right into it, a piece of every person who had worn those fabrics before. A modern family buys a blanket. She built an heirloom out of grief and thrift and skill, by hand in the evenings, and never once thought to call it art. She reconstructed the socks and the stockings. Picture it, because it's one of the most tender images in the whole house. A worn wooden egg pushed down into the toe of a sock, the mother's hand turning it, the needle weaving a whole new patch of fabric right where the hole had opened, thread crossing thread until the heel was solid again. This wasn't a quick knot. This was reweaving, actually rebuilding the missing cloth with her own 2 hands so that a pair of socks lasted a winter, and then another winter. Every child in that house walked on heels their mother had rebuilt. We throw socks away now. We wouldn't know where to begin. She made the sweaters and the mittens and the caps. From yarn, and sometimes from yarn she had unraveled from a sweater grown too small and rolled back into a ball to knit again, she made the warm things. The needles clicked by the fire in the evening while the radio played low, and out of that steady motion came the mittens on a small pair of hands walking to school in the cold, and the cap, and the heavy socks for a working man's boots. She made the curtains, and the tablecloths, and the linens that dressed the whole house, the windows, the good table for Sunday, the bed, She sewed the soft architecture of the home itself. A house was not decorated by a store. It was dressed by the woman who lived in it, in fabric she had chosen and cut and hemmed to fit her own windows and her own table. Now let's move out of the sewing corner, because there is one more territory of skill, and it may be the one we've forgotten most completely of all. She kept the house itself running. The small repairs, the small manufactures, the doctoring, the 100 quiet things that today we would never dream of doing ourselves. She made the candles. When the power failed or the money for oil ran short, light did not simply stop in that house. She had made candles against exactly that day, and the family read and sewed and gathered by a flame she had produced with her own hands. She was, quietly, her own utility company. She made the containers that organized her whole kitchen. Not organizers bought in a set, a glass jar washed and kept for the flour, a tin fitted with a lid for the sugar, a cloth sack for the beans. She built her own pantry system out of what passed through the house, and she knew, without opening a single thing, exactly what was in each one and exactly how much was left. She was the inventory, held entirely in her own head. There was no app. There was a woman who simply knew what her family had. She made the small repairs that kept the house standing. A loose chair leg tightened, a cracked handle bound, a drafty window sealed for winter with cloth and paste, a worn spot on a floor covered. She did not wait for a man, and she did not call for one, for the small things. She fixed them, because a house has 100 small failures a year, and a family cannot buy its way out of every one. She made the brooms and the brushes last, and the rags that cleaned the house, and the mats for the floor, braiding old cloth into a rug that lay by the door and caught the mud, so that the good floor underneath was protected by a thing she had woven from what the house already held. And then there was the hardest work of all, the work she did at 3 a.m, when a child was burning up and there was no money for a doctor and no doctor to call. She made the medicine. I want to be careful and honest here, because this was a world before we understood a great many things, and not every home remedy was wise, and some children were lost that a doctor could have saved. That is the hard truth, and I won't paint over it. But within what that mother knew, she was the family's first nurse, and its first pharmacy. She made the syrup that eased a cough enough to let a child sleep. She made the poultice, warm against a congested chest. She made the salve for the cracked hands, and the chapped skin of a family that worked outdoors in the cold. She knew the tea for the upset stomach, and the compress for the fever, and she sat up through the night applying them. Because when a child is sick at 3 a.m, the store is closed, the doctor is far, and the only thing standing between that child and the dark is a mother who knows what to do with her own 2 hands. That is not a small thing. That may be the largest thing in this entire video. She was the emergency room of that house, and she carried it without a certificate, without a paycheck, and usually without a word of thanks, because everyone simply assumed a mother would know. Now let me stop and do the thing I asked you to do at the beginning. Let me count them with you. Bread, biscuits and cornbread, rendered fat and shortening, broth, gravy and sauce, jam and fruit butter, syrup, pickles and kraut, butter and cheese, soap, cleaners and scouring, stain treatment, furniture polish, dresses from the sacks, aprons and children's clothes, quilts, reconstructed socks, sweaters and mittens, curtains and linens, candles, storage containers, household repairs, braided rugs, and medicine. That's the 25. Written down like that, in a plain list, it almost looks like a store directory, and that is exactly the point. That was not a list of chores. That was a woman, standing in for an entire economy. A bakery, a dairy, a cannery, a soapworks, a tailor, a seamstress, a quilter, a repair shop, a candle maker, and a nurse, all of it living inside one ordinary person in a plain wooden house, working by the light of one window and one lamp, and never once believing she was doing anything special. And here is where nostalgia has to turn into something more honest. We didn't lose these things because we grew wiser. We lost them because someone figured out that every single one of them could be sold back to us. The dress, the bread, the soap, the jam, the blanket, the medicine. One by one, a store put a price tag on what a mother used to make for free, and one by one, we agreed to pay it, and one by one, we forgot how. We are the generation that pays for all 25 and could make almost none of them. Which brings us back, at last, to the number I asked you to keep. So, what was your number? 25 things that one ordinary woman made with her own hands, in a plain kitchen, in a hard decade, and I asked you, back at the beginning, to keep a quiet count of how many of them you could still make yourself, today, if the store were closed and no one was coming to help. For most of us, the honest number is small, 2, 3, maybe 5 on a good day, with a recipe open in front of us and a little luck. And there is no shame in that number. You didn't choose to lose these skills. They were taken from you, gently, one purchase at a time, by a world that found it more profitable for you to buy than to know. But I don't want you to close this video feeling only that we've lost something, because that isn't the whole truth, and it isn't the reason we came here today. We came here to see her clearly, maybe for the first time. Because when you were a child, you may not have understood what you were looking at. You saw a mother at the stove before dawn, a grandmother at the sewing machine at night, a woman rendering fat and boiling jars and rebuilding the heel of your sock, and it just looked like what mothers did. It looked ordinary. It may even have looked, to a young person, a little old-fashioned, a little behind the times, a little too careful. Now you know what you were really watching. You were watching a person of extraordinary skill do extraordinary work and refuse to call it that. You were watching a baker, a nurse, a seamstress, and an engineer, all folded into the woman who tucked you in. You were watching knowledge that had come down through her hands, from her mother's hands, being quietly poured into a family that mostly didn't notice, and would only understand, some of them, 60 years later, watching a video like this one. That is what this was really about. Not soap, not bread, not the 25 things themselves. It was about her, and the kind of home she was able to build with a pair of hands, and a head full of knowing. She was often poor. Her life was often hard. We should never dress that decade up as something beautiful, because for the people living it, it frequently was not. But a poor house with that woman inside it was never, not for one single day, a helpless house. She had less than we have, and she knew more than we know. Both of those things are true, and the second one is the one we forgot. So here is what I'll ask of you before you go. This week, make one thing, just one. Bake the loaf instead of buying it. Simmer a real broth on the back of the stove the way she did. Mend the thing instead of tossing it. Make one small thing with your own 2 hands, not because you have to, but because she could, and because that skill deserves to be remembered by being used, even once, even badly. That is how you honor a pair of hands that are gone now. You pick the work back up. If this brought her back to you, your mother, your grandmother, the woman whose hands you can still see if you close your eyes, then do 3 quick things for me. Subscribe to the Depression-era home so we can keep walking back through these rooms together. Give this video a like so it finds the others who remember. And most of all, go down to the comments and tell us, what did your mother, your grandmother, or someone you loved make with their own hands instead of buying? Name the one thing you still remember. The dress, the soap, the syrup, the salve, whatever it was. Because your memory, written down in a sentence, might be the thing that helps a stranger remember theirs. And that woman, whoever she was to you, deserves to be remembered out loud. She made it herself, every bit of it, and she never once asked to be thanked. The least we can do, all these years later, is finally understand what she was.